thanks for everybody joining us here, and this is another opportunity for us all to get together to remember our shared heritage. My name is Scott Gallinghouse. I happen to usually be the sole representative of the Gallinghouse branch of the family, but I try to make up for it by being the loudest member of all three families. So if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, the first thing I wanted to do was talk about the origin of the name. It's Girlinghouse or Gallinghouse now, but if you take it back to its original version, it would have been spelled Gerlingshausen. And there are variations on that. I've counted so far between Germany and America 47 different variations of spelling on the name. But to talk about the types of surnames and tell you where this comes from and what the name actually means, and all names have a meaning, there are four types of surnames that have developed since about the 1100s in Western Europe. There's something called the patronymic, and that's a surname that's based on the first name of the father. And you see these names, Harrelson, Peterson, Williamson. It's William's son, literally. And versions of that are all over Western Europe. Sometimes Mac or O stands in for son. So Macmillan, Lib's maiden name, was son of Millen. There's another type of surname that's the occupational surname. Cooper, Taylor, Wagoner, Zimmerman, Coleman in our own family is a man who collected and sold coal. There's also a type of surname that's based on a nickname for some kind of personality or character trait. Stout, small. Breidup locally is a German name that literally means big head. So somebody in the Breidup family had a big head, and that became their last name. Finally, habitation or place names, and that is a name such as Tanton, which is named after a small farm in Somerset, England. Roseback, which literally means red brook or reddish swamp. And our name, which actually takes components of several different types of surnames. The components of, and I'll try to pronounce it the way I've been told by a German, our last name would actually have been pronounced in Germany. It's something like Gerlingshausen. It's somewhere between the phoneticization of my last name and having that R in there that was still sort of a guttural in the German pronunciation. But to start with the last first, Hausen is a suffix, literally means house or dwelling place. Ing with the S means kin or sons or descendants or the tribe or clan. And then the G-E-R is from Old German, pre-7th century German, that means spear or spear carrier or spearman. And the spearman or the spear carrier in the German barbarian armies was not someone who threw the spears. They were the most courageous of the soldiers because they literally carried the spears at their sides. They were in the front of the German phalanx because their job, their mission, was to gut the horses of the Roman cavalry riders. So they were the first ones out, and they were the ones most likely to be killed. So our last name, our shared name, is a composite name from pre-7th century cultural times. It literally means the settlement of the tribe or the clan of the spearmen or the spear carriers. And so if you see the name Garlinghouse, that's another name. We think we're distantly related, at least as a clan, because that last name, which you'll see all over the United States, practically everywhere but Louisiana, that last name basically means the same thing that our last name means. The G-A-R is also a corruption of the G-E-R-I, which stands for spear or spear carrier. Then I want to tell you about the significance of ing. And I'm happy that after a lot of variations in our last names over the years, we've all gotten to where ing is a constant in both branches of the family. There's a significance there that's really something fascinating and important to know. According to the old Roman poet Tacitus, the Germanic or Teutonic peoples pursued a mythology in which the earth god Tuisto had a son, Manus. Manus was the founder of the Germanic or the Teutonic race. Manus was said to have three sons, and those three sons founded three distinct groups. Those nearest the sea were called the Ingveones, or the friends or disciples of Ing. Those in the middle area were the Hermanones, and the rest were known as the Isveones. Now, we're descended from the Ingveones. The Ingveones occupied the North German coastal areas and were composed of the Cimbri, the Teutons, the Chauci, and they joined with other coastal tribes such as the Angles, the Jutes, the Saxons, the Frisians, and the Franks, and that group invaded South Britain. So Ing, or Ingve, the lord of the Ingveones, was a fertility god, and that explains a lot about our family too, I think. Ingveones literally means the friends of Ing, and they formed the bulk of the settlement in Britain. In England may in fact be a phonetic corruption of a pun on the name of Ing, as Angleland or the land of Ing. So even more relevantly, consider the names that we're familiar with in England. The suffixes ham or ton in Britain correspond to the German suffix hausen. Ham signifies home. It's just a phonetic corruption of that word. Ton signifies town. Another phonetic corruption of that more familiar word. So home and ton you find in place names such as Buckingham, Birmingham, Kensington, and Wellington. Well, transpose that back to Germany and it would be very, very similar to Gerlingshausen or Islingshausen or some other names that you might find in Westphalia in particular. So you spot the phonetic element in those syllables, and its emphasis is on the family bond, or that medial syllable ing. So we maintained it. It's all representative of a close family association or a clan. And a lot of what happened was these coastal sea raiders were essentially pirates. They would move from place to place, literally invade a coastal area, push out the indigenous population, and then settle there. There is a settlement not far from our family ancestral village, Herborn, called Gerlingshausen. There is not one person with that last name in that village, and never has been as far as we can determine. But it's a possibility that someone who started out with a different last name took that name when he left that village and moved away to someplace else. I can tell you, and you're all able to verify this by going on websites like FamilySearch.org, which is the Mormon site. It's a free site. Anybody can go on there. Our last name is possibly the rarest surname in Germany. You won't find it often, but when you do find it and its variations in spelling, it's almost a certainty that that's a relative of ours. It makes it a lot easier to search out the family and try to find the common relationships. Now, having said that, I can tell you the first known appearance of the name is as early as 1524, which is 100 years before the 30 Years' War, which is amazing. It's fascinating that we were able to find a mention of the last name that early, because a lot of municipal and state records were wiped out in the 30 Years' War that took place between 1618 and 1648 in Germany. But the earliest mention of the family name that we can find so far, we'll keep digging, is in a listing of prominent men in the Dieburg district in Hesse. And includes the name of the pastor Conrad Gerlingshausen, located in the town of Babenhausen in Hessen near Frankfurt. Conrad is again mentioned in the compilation of these important, significant men in this district as a priest from Altdorf in 1535. Now understand, being a Lutheran priest at that time was a very courageous thing to do in itself, because Luther had just posted his theses on the church door in 1518. So to immediately step into the place and say, I'm taking on the papacy in Rome and I'm going to prepare myself as a priest in the Lutheran religion is a fairly courageous thing for Conrad to have done, and he apparently made his mark. Now, the next mention of the name, you have to flash forward in the records almost 100 years. But we can date the use of our last name to the end of the 15th century, because obviously Conrad was born before 1524 to have become a priest in that time. So at least we can relate it back to the late 15th century, the late 1400s. Now, we don't have any firm date relating Conrad to any of the rest of the family, but the rarity of the name makes it almost a certainty that he is a relative. And that's a pretty strong argument for that conclusion. But the next verifiable mention of the Gerlinghausen surname is in Frankfurt nearly a century later, as I said a minute ago. The records that we found document the existence of a Wilhelm Gerlinghausen, who was a storekeeper of linens, and he became a burgher or citizen in Frankfurt on May 4th, 1621. A very conspicuous honor in a city-state as large as Frankfurt at that time. Wilhelm and his wife, whose first name is never given in the records, their last name is Adelberg, became the parents of 2 sons and 4 daughters between 1622, right after he became a citizen, and 1635, according to records that my friend Trudy Schenk has extracted from the Evangelical Lutheran Church. Records maintained as the ancestor list of Brother Thomas state that Wilhelm was from the Westphalian village of Schwelm, and according to the records of Brother Thomas, Wilhelm died in 1637 in Frankfurt. Now, what else can we learn from those records? Well, Wilhelm's wife remarried June 5th, 1637, so he died prior to that date, I hope. Wilhelm must have been a man of accomplishment to have been elevated to the status of citizenship in Frankfurt. That suggests that he had pursued his trade for a number of years prior to his 61 acquisition of burgher status, and since his wife gave birth to a number of children in Frankfurt between 1622 and 1635, all after he achieved citizenship, it suggested to me a couple of possibilities. First, that his wife may have been significantly younger than Wilhelm. German men usually didn't marry until their mid-20s at the earliest, and that's because they needed to establish themselves in a profession first before they were financially able to support a family. A good idea for us now, but we've lost that idea. And Wilhelm was apparently distinguished in his profession enough to achieve citizenship in Frankfurt. And that leads to another inference, and we've talked among ourselves about these, and a lot of these things are going to have to be deductions to take us in further directions about researching the family history, but a lot of it's got a lot of logic behind it, so any of us can come up with these ideas, and I invite you all to share the ideas that you might come up with after hearing this presentation or doing some of the research yourselves. It's a lot of fun. We think he might have had another family in Schwelm before he moved into Frankfurt, and if that's the case, he was likely born in the late 16th century and may have had a previous wife elsewhere. He had other older children, and I'll relate that in a minute to another generation of the family. And the godparent at the baptism of Wilhelm's son, Hans Conrad Gerlingshausen, who was born October 14, 1630, was Hans Conrad Gerlingshausen, a linen salesman. We raised the question, was this a brother after whom Wilhelm named his child? Because a godparent undertook the obligation to raise a child in the event of the death of his parents, it's unlikely that Wilhelm and his wife would have selected someone older than themselves. If anything, they would have looked for somebody younger. So was Hans Conrad Gerlingshausen, linen salesman, a younger brother of Wilhelm? Certainly he was a close relationship. So if that's a notion that we can act on, then we can go back to the records in these surrounding areas and try to research the family name a little bit further. And I've recently discovered, and we've got this in the back if you'd like to look at it, a Johann Gallinghausen died on July 22nd, 1636 in the village of Schwert in Westphalia, a village very close to Schwelm and a village very close to another village that we'll mention in a minute, Sprachhovel. No other information is as yet available on this Johann, but because of the timing and the similarity of the name and the rareness of the surname, we think that this is another helpful lead, and it's got some promise, so I'm going to pursue it in the Mormon records. And just to give you an insight on those free records, the Mormons decided about 5 years ago they're going to transcribe every one of the 23 billion records they've got buried in a huge mountaintop vault out in Salt Lake City. It's taking longer than they thought, and partially that's because every transcription has to be checked by 3 people. The original transcriber, a second transcriber, and if those two differ in any regard, there's an arbitrator that reviews that transcription for accuracy, and they make a decision among the 3 of them. So it's a lot longer process than they were anticipating. But eventually 23 billion records will be available online for anybody to look at and to print off. And I've printed off some of them for you in the back. They're beautiful, clear prints that anybody can put together. I invite everybody to do it. It's a blast. I can't tell you how much fun I have with it. And it keeps me tied to everybody else here, which is very important to me, if you didn't notice. Now, up to now, in these records, we have no confirmation, I said, that Conrad or Wilhelm are related to us, other than it's almost a certainty because of the rarity of the surname. And we're now at a point in the German records where that identity of occupations, the linen handlers, and some other things that I can mention, we're now up to the point in the records where we've got an absolute verifiable identifiable relationship to our family. And that's based on a combination of records that my friend Trudy Schenk found, abstracting records from a little village called Grunberg and our ancestral village, Herborn. We now know that our earliest identifiable ancestor was a gentleman named Clemens Gerlingshausen. He was a citizen of Sprachhovel, so he was obviously a man of some stature as well, because becoming a burgher was not as easy. You got voting privileges and a lot of other things, so that was something that was jealously guarded by all the municipalities. So if you became a citizen, you earned it, absolutely. And we now know that Clemens was the father of at least 2 children, and maybe a third, and I'll talk about that in a minute. First of all, our ancestor, Johann Arnold Gerlinghausen, who was born in 1641 and died April 4th, 1721. His younger brother, probably Johann Georg Gallinghausen, was a salesman of linen and a town official in Grunsburg. And we don't know the date of his birth, but we do know that he died October 20th, 1720. There's also a strong possibility that Clemens was the father of a third child, a daughter, Gertrude Gallinghausen. She's listed as marrying a Heinrich Stemmler in Grunberg on March 9, 1685. That would put her at an age that would make it impossible for her to be the daughter of Johann Georg, with whom she was living, and there's no evidence to suggest that she could have been the daughter of Clemens' other child, Johann Arnold, our ancestor, so his children are all documented and she is not among them. So it's a good argument that Clemens, about whom we know very little otherwise, had at least 3 children. But what else could we at least deduce about Clemens? He was described as a citizen. That would suggest that he was a man of higher status. We know that his son, our ancestor Johann Arnold Gerlinghausen, was born in 1641, so that Clemens married Johann Arnold's mother, whoever that might have been, at the latest in early 1641. If he followed the traditional social mores and values prevalent in Germany at the time, then he would have been at least in his mid-20s in 1641. If that marriage was his first marriage, that would put his birth date back to about 1615 or earlier. I raised the question, and we don't know the answer yet, but it gives us a matrix to sort of search. Could that mean that Clemens is a child of Wilhelm, the burgher in Frankfurt, that was born to an earlier marriage? Research is going to continue. I'm not going to let it go. I promised my brother. We do know from records in Herborn that Clemens had died before the January 1667 marriage of his son, Johann Arnold, to Anna Katharina Walter in Herborn. And I'm going to mangle a lot of these last names, so just indulge me. Our second generation of verifiable ancestors was Johann Arnold Gerlinghausen. As I said, his dates are 1641 to April 4, 1721. He settled in Herborn and must have been only there a little bit of time when he first got married, because the name is transcribed differently in those earliest records about the 1660s. It starts off with an E. The G is dropped altogether, and that's one of those 47 variations I was talking about. He and his wife Anna had 7 known children. Johann Peter Gerlinghausen, who was born in 1668, and he's listed among the attendees at the University of Herborn, and that is a very great distinction. He started there at the age of 10 and graduated in 1689 at the age of 21. That university is one of the oldest universities in the world. It was begun in 1585, and a lot of the people that translated the Bible into the various languages in Western Europe learned the Bible in Bible studies at the university in Herborn. So it was a big, big accomplishment to have gone there. And I really am interested in researching Johann Peter further. We didn't research him at the time of putting together the ancestry because he is a relative. He's not a direct ancestor. Arnold and Anna's second child was Hans Heinrich Gerlinghausen, who was born December 26, 1670, and died less than a week later in January. Anna Katrin Gerlinghausen died at the age of a little more than 3 years. Johann Jacob Gerlinghausen died at 2 months of age, and you can see why people tended to have large families. Most of their children weren't going to make it to adulthood at that time. The fourth child, Johann Jacob, died at 2 months of age. The fifth child, Elizabeth Gerlinghausen, about whom we currently know no more than her christening date, October 31st, 1677. Another ancestor relative that I'd like to research further. And then our third generation ancestor, and what I'm doing is starting first generation being Clemens and then moving forward in time. We have 7 generations in Germany that we've been able to verify. Margaretha Elisabeth Gerlingshausen, we don't know anything else. The 7th child, Johann Georg, was christened April 6, 1686, and named after his godfather and uncle from Grunberg. So there's the ability to tie in those 2 branches of the family between the village of Herborn and the nearby village of Grunberg. What else can we say about Arnold? He attended the marriage of his brother, Johann Georg, to Anna Katharina Reitz, February 13, 1678, in Kurtgarten, which is outside of Frankfurt. So you can see this is all taking place in a very small area. We tend to think about other countries based on the size of the United States, but really the entire country of Germany is about the equivalent size of the state of Texas. So all of these things were actually happening in a fairly circumscribed area. We know that Arnold was a stocking weaver. He married Maria Magdalena Jungst in Herborn's Evangelical Lutheran Church, March 1st, 1734. And that couple had 5 children. Anna Maria, born in 1735. Johann Heinrich Ludwig, born July 5th, 1738, died December 5th, 1739. Johann Ludwig, born April 3rd, 1742. Susanna Margareta, born April 6, 1744. And then our 5th generation ancestor, Georg Ludwig, born April 16, 1747. And one of the things that you see when you start researching these families, the fact that we're all here is a combination of the most arbitrary coincidences. Some generations had 1 child, that's all. We would not be here but for that circumstance, having fallen into line exactly right, and that 1 child making it to adulthood and marrying and having children. So we know that Johann Arnold, our 4th generation ancestor, died at the age of 36, September 10, 1748. His wife, Mary Magdalena, died 4 months later, January 12, 1749. Now my friend, and your friend, believe me, Trudy Schenk, our researcher out in Salt Lake City, had speculated, and it was pretty plausible, that those orphan children, because these parents died unusually young even for that time period, were raised by their grandparents, Johann Georg and Anna Ursula Walther. But I did some further research, and I established that Johann Georg was already deceased at the time of his son Arnold's marriage to Anna Ursula Walther. And when our 5th generation ancestor Georg was little more than 10 years old, and who raised Georg remains a mystery. We'll probably be able to find something like that because, like other civilian jurisdictions, and Western Germany, very much like Louisiana, was a civil code oriented jurisdiction. It wasn't common law like Britain was. So we ought to be able to find those records, particularly because if Germans are obsessive about one thing, it's recording their daily lives. France, exactly the opposite. Those records are a mess. They're a nightmare because the French would care more about drinking wine than keeping records, and keeping our airplanes from flying over space to go to Libya. But that's another conversation we won't have right now. Georg, our 5th generation ancestor, followed in his father's footsteps, which kids ordinarily did at that time, and also became a stocking weaver in Herborn. We do not know what constraints he might have suffered through, but he didn't get married until August 1788, when he was already 41 years old. That really was late to start a family in Germany at the time, because most people didn't expect to live to be 41 years old. But he married Maria Margareta Steyhoff, the daughter of a citizen and another stocking weaver, Jost Heinrich Steyhoff. And within a year, the couple had their first child, Elisabetha Juliana Gerlinghausen, born June 14, 1789. Johann Jost Gerlinghausen, who died of smallpox March 29, 1795, at the age of 5. Maria Margareta Elisabetha Gerlinghausen, born October 26, 1793. Keep her in mind. A little girl who was born and died the same day on December 13, 1796. And then finally, our 6th generation ancestor, Heinrich Ludwig Gerlinghausen, who was born May 9, 1798. His older sister, who we call Elizabeth, is equally important for a variety of reasons that I'll get to in a little while. Heinrich Ludwig married Anna Margareta Weissgerber, and Weissgerber is another occupation name. It literally means tanner of white leather, or called a bleacher. They married in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Herborn at 2 o'clock, we even know the time, in the afternoon of May 2nd, 1824. Heinrich had become a master cabinet maker at that point, because economic reversals after the Napoleonic Wars in the early part of the 1800s had eliminated the import markets for Herborn for stocking weavers. So you could not have survived and supported a family as a stocking weaver. So instead of following in his father's footsteps, he became a master cabinet maker. And it just explained as a sort of a sideline, I did some research on this. The minute they became masters because the guild of carpenters evaluated your work. How you would do this is you'd start off as an apprentice to a master carpenter. After a few years as an apprentice, you would become what was known as a journeyman. And you would literally do what the name suggests. You would journey around the larger area in Germany, go to the other carpenters, and learn their specialties. You would come back, and after you consolidated all that information and knowledge, you would construct what you would call your masterpiece. Because your masterpiece was designed to become a master carpenter, and then you would start the cycle over. The other guild's members would evaluate your masterpiece once it was submitted, say, yes, he has become a master carpenter. He can now teach apprentices and journeymen himself. And that's exactly what Heinrich Ludwig did. After he married, the couple had the first child, Heinrich Wilhelm Gallinghouse, on February 28, 1825. He was christened March 13, 1825, and his godmother was listed as Elizabeth Henrietta Gerlingshausen. I believe that was Margaret, the sister born in 1793. It's not exactly the same name, but you'd have to understand, the eldest sister, Elisabetha Juliana, Germans did not refer to each other by their first names. They referred to each other by their middle names. So it was Maria Margareta Elisabetha Henrietta that we believe was Elizabeth Gerlingshausen, the godmother of the oldest child. Heinrich Ludwig and Anna Margareta had 4 children overall. All were born in Herborn. As I said, Heinrich Wilhelm, he would have been known as Wilhelm, born February 28, 1825, died at the age of 12, August 3, 1837. Katharina Elisabetha Gerlinghausen, born May 16, 1827. Heinrich Ludwig Gerlinghausen, born May 12, 1830, and Christian Heinrich Gerlinghausen, born November 12, 1833. Now what's interesting in the records is by the time of the birth of the second child, her godmother was listed as Elizabeth Rosebeck of Marburg. So clearly the father's sister had married Christian Rosebeck between February of 1825, when the oldest child was baptized, and May of 1827, which was the birth date of the second child, Katharina Elizabeth. And the couple, Christian and Elizabeth Rosebeck, had moved to Marburg. Christian Rosebeck was actually named godfather of the youngest of the 4 children, Christian Heinrich Gerlinghausen. So here we are, late in 1834, Christian and Elizabeth Gerlinghausen Rosebeck left Herborn bound for America. The couple arrived at the port of New Orleans, and I was just able to verify this recently. They arrived in New Orleans December 30th, 1834, and according to the naturalization records that Christian Rosebeck filed in Natchez in 1852, the couple had been in Mississippi and in Natchez exactly the same time as they had been in the United States. So we know from that they did arrive in the port of New Orleans December 30th, 1834, and they immediately went up Mississippi to Natchez, which is where they settled. And it's highly likely that once they arrived in Natchez and settled, they started corresponding with Elizabeth's younger brother, Heinrich. Elizabeth is an amazing lady in our family history for a number of reasons, but one of which is that she's the first verifiable relative of ours to set foot in America. Her brother was the second that we know of. A little more than 2 months after the death of their oldest child, Heinrich Wilhelm, the 3 surviving children, Elizabeth, Henry, and Christian, to give them their Americanized names, left with their parents, Heinrich Ludwig and Anna Margareta. They left Herborn for the port of Bremerhaven, and the family sailed from Bremen on the ship Draper on October 12, 1837, under the captaincy of J.A. Hillert. I went to Baltimore a few years ago on business with my company, and I managed to get to the library in Baltimore and find the old newspaper, so I now am able to say with certainty how long the trip took. With 113 passengers, wheat, merchandise, all below deck. I can't imagine what that was like, but it literally took 7 weeks for them to move from Bremen to the port of Baltimore. And we know they were there in Baltimore from December 5th to January 1st of 1838, so 3 weeks. And why you would stay in the port for 3 weeks, we really don't know. It may have been a quarantine, but there's no evidence of that. So with those passengers, those 3 children arrived with their parents, and those 3 children are responsible for us. We would not be here but for those 3 children. Now, I can tell you the rest of the adventure only started there, and that's the end of my prepared remarks, but if y'all want me to go on, I can tell you a lot of the story beyond there, including the mysteries we have with those first years in America. Heinrich Ludwig, we never know anything about again. He disappears once he leaves Baltimore, January 1st, 1838. What happened to Margaret? We can speculate. And the reason we've got some basis for speculation is because of the records in Adams County, Mississippi. We know Christian and Elizabeth Rosebeck were there. In fact, the Girlinghouse side of the family brought down some very useful family traditions, which is that the Gerlingshausen family, those 3 children, were raised by their Aunt Rosebeck. Well, that seems to relate to what we can prove so far in the Adams County records. We would expect and should have seen Christian and Elizabeth listed in the various census records. We do not. But we see one name crop up in the 1840 federal census, the 1841 state census of Mississippi, and the 1845 state census of Mississippi. M. Garlinghouse, a female between 40 and 45 years old, with the correct number of people living in that household. Our speculation, and I think it's fairly well informed, is that she was the head of the household and Christian Rosebeck deferred to her, so that where he should have been listed as the head of household in the various census records, he was not. I think that was Margaret. Will we be able to prove that? Maybe, maybe not. But at least through 1845, we think that she was in Natchez and the family was still as intact as it could have been. Now that suggests that Heinrich Ludwig died shortly after his arrival in the United States. We may never be able to prove or disprove that, but certainly he disappears from the records. We've also got records from Natchez that show that Christian Rosebeck bought a house on a 1/4 of an acre on Canal Street in Natchez, right along the river. We're going to do some abstracting of that title and see if we can find anything further, including the location of that property, because I think it would really be neat to be able to go there and do some kind of a marker for the first place where the family is likely to have lived in the United States. Now there is that gap between 1838 and 1840 that we can't fill. But Christian, the youngest of the children that came over, put in several records that he was born in New York. He was not. Obviously, he was born in Germany. But something made him think that he was born in New York. And maybe they lived in New York for a time after they left Baltimore. That's certainly speculation at the moment. We've tried to research the last name in New York. We find nothing, but I do find a lot of Rosebecks. So that's a possibility that we'll also pursue. What we're doing is trying to fill in the gaps. All these little hiatuses that are still mysteries for us. I do not like mysteries. I love having them, but only if I can solve them. It annoys the heck out of me to not be able to solve a mystery. So I'm going to keep at this as long as I can keep at it. And the more we can consolidate, the more that what sounds like the same presentation year in and year out really won't be, because I'll keep adding further information. Once you get past 1845, you start to see Christian and Elizabeth pop up in the records over in Natchez. So that suggests to us that Margaret, if that was Margaret as M. Garlinghouse, then that's when she would have passed away in the mid-1840s. At that point, Christian Rosebeck had also done something, thank God for us, very far-sighted. He had loaned money to a gentleman named Michael McMillan in Catahoula Parish. And Mr. McMillan had mortgaged 75 acres, more or less, in what's now Manifest. But it wasn't called Manifest at the time, it was called Pisgah, after the mountain range in the Old Testament where God allowed Moses to look out over the promised land but would never allow him to go in. It was Mount Nebo in the Pisgah mountain range. So it's a good possibility that our family named both of those places. And that 75 acres, more or less, that Christian Rosbeck got a mortgage on was what he foreclosed on in 1845, and he donated that land to the eldest of the three children that came over from Germany in 1837, my great-great-great-aunt Elizabeth. And so we believe that the three children wound up living there when Elizabeth married her husband Laban Ford. Laban Ford had property right above that 75 acres, and between their two ownerships, that probably covers the vast majority of Manifest. So there we have the three children probably all living together with Elizabeth and her new husband. Elizabeth started a family, and her children that we know of are Martha Ford, born around 1847, her daughter Emily that was born in about 1851 but died young apparently, her son Henry L. Ford, who was born around 1852, according to family tradition died in New Orleans in 1878 in one of the yellow fever plagues, their son Laban, born in 1855, and their daughter Nancy L. Ford, who was born in 1859, and is responsible for the Tanton line. She gave birth to Bullard Tanton in 1877, and the Coleman line, which is how those various branches of the Ford are related to us. My great-great-grandfather Henry went by the name Gallingshausen because we think some customs official told them how you spell what you're saying is G-A-L-I-N-G-H-A-U-S-E-N. Even though that was a corruption of the actual spelling, it sounded enough like the pronunciation that that's what the name was for a long time. And in fact, Christian Girlinghouse initially took the last name Gallinghausen as well. Now Henry became a steamboat pilot, and he worked between New Orleans and a little town called Washington, Louisiana, that was known as the much less pleasant term Niggerville at the time, as opposed to Whiteville that was nearby. Now if you read the sanitized history of St. Landry Parish, Whiteville was supposedly named Whiteville because of the white picket fence in front of the mayor's house. Don't you believe it? It was because that was where the white folks lived, and my family lived where the white folks didn't live. And that maybe explains why the first child was named George Washington Gallinghausen, which really drove my Uncle Jerry crazy. But of course you wouldn't have named a child that at the time for the same reasons that you might now. But the two brothers wound up in St. Landry Parish. We've got fantastic information about Christians living there at the time. He was a witness and an appraiser to several successions that we were in my great-great-great-grandmother's branch of the family, the Shermans. We know that they left St. Landry Parish in 1856. Christian wound up living in Algiers, and he married a girl who was the daughter of the saloon keeper, no comment, in 1857, and he wound up staying in the New Orleans area until around 1859, when his wife decided that she really liked the guy she had been dating before she married Christian better than she liked Christian, so she had a baby with this gentleman, Philip Wolfe, and they divorced, and Christian moved back to Catahoula with his sister Elizabeth and their family, the Ford family. Meanwhile, my great-great-grandfather Henry, the middle child, stayed in New Orleans until the late 1850s and moved back to St. Landry Parish, where he had a family, and continued being a riverboat pilot between New Orleans and Washington until the Civil War. Well, he and Christian both went into the Civil War. In fact, Christian, the youngest son, had to surrender at Vicksburg July 4th of 1863, excuse me, and Henry was fighting at Port Hudson. Once Vicksburg fell, Port Hudson gave up. There was no reason to try to fight to hold the Mississippi River open because the Union forces controlled the Mississippi, the minute that Vicksburg capitulated. So they both went back to their respective homes. Christian married a lady named Joanna Croom, or Crooms. They had 4 sons that we know of, Matthew, William, Newman, and Christian Jr. And 3 of them had pretty large families. Matthew and his wife had 13 children, I think. Newman had 11, and Christian had 5. William and his wife Emma lost 3 children right in childbirth. So William, as far as we know, has no descendants. My great-great-grandfather Henry had at least 9 children, possibly 10, and one of them, the third child, was Elijah Henry, who was my great-grandfather. He, let's just say he got around a lot. I think he changed his religion about 10 times based on the religion of the girl he was dating while his wife was passing away bit by bit at home. You can hear more about that story, but I'm not putting it on these recorded remarks. But I'm happy to tell anybody if they want to know. So you can get all the way up to the early part of the 20th century, and I can tell you all that story. But the fascinating thing to me about it is that there's so much coincidence to put any of us here. Year after year, all of these things that conspired to kill them all, they survived it all. I've always said to my cousins on the Gallinghouse side, thank God the Girlinghouses were as prolific as roaches, because there's so many of them. We've got all the cousins we could ever want. But I'll tell you this, I'm looking for more of them all the time. There were other Girlinghouses in the United States. There's some in Britain right now. We do not know if they're related to us or not, but there's a pretty darn good chance. And certainly the last name means the same thing as our last name. So if they're not direct relationships, they've got to be distant relationships. They're all friends of ink. Thanks.